Welcome to another crochet tutorial with Cosy Rosie UK. Today I'm going to be talking to you about yarn substitution for those instances where the yarn that's recommended in a crochet pattern just isn't in your yarn stash, or perhaps you want to select a different yarn. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and of course the notification bell so that you never miss out on another one of my crochet tutorials or free pattern tutorials again. Some of the things to consider when you are substituting yarn is, of course, the size of the yarn that you've been recommended to use, the hook size that has been recommended, of course, the fibre content, and more importantly, the finished size you're looking to create. Over the course of this video, we're going to talk about some of those subjects in a bit more detail so that you can make those yarn substitutions with confidence, as well as sharing a little secret on where you can find all the information easily. One of the things that I think is really important to remember is that ultimately a crochet pattern is there for you to recreate the finished project that designer has made. They might give you instructions on how to change the finished size, and they might give you instructions on how to make some other adjustments too. But ultimately what you're doing is recreating that finished project that the crochet designer has made. That doesn't mean, of course, that you can't put your own little spin on it. And one of those ways to do that would be, of course, to substitute the yarn. There are a number of reasons as to why you might need to substitute the yarn that you're using that's recommended in the pattern, from perhaps that yarn's now discontinued and you simply cannot purchase it, perhaps that yarn isn't available in the country that you're living in, or the delivery costs are going to be a little bit too pricey. It might be that the shade that they've made it in is no longer available or is out of stock, most frustrating thing ever. Or you might simply just want to grab a ball of yarn from your stash to use some of that up. Some of the really important information that's included in our crochet patterns can have an impact if you change or substitute that yarn for a different one that's recommended. This includes the hook size that you're going to be needing to use, the gauge that you might get with that pattern, and therefore it might increase or decrease the size of that finished project. Or it could be that the fibre content is actually going to create a different feel to the crochet fabric or the finished project that you're making. This means that the information that's included in those all-important pattern notes, such as the gauge and the finished size, might change if you select a different yarn size. The actual changing of the finished size can be a benefit. For instance, there are lots of amigurumi projects that use, in case you don't know, amigurumi is the Japanese style of creating dolls and just using different shapes to create a solid form that are sewn together. Little side note. But amigurumi can be instantly changed from a little tiny doll into a massive project just by simply changing the weight of the yarn that you're using. So let's break down some of these bigger areas that we need to think about when we're changing or substituting our yarn. So yarn weight is one of the biggest considerations when it comes to swapping out or substitute or changing the yarn that's recommended in the crochet pattern. This is where the international ways of sizing yarn come into play, because there are three different ways that yarns are measured and described for their size or their yarn weight. Yarn weight is literally a description as to how many plies or strands are kind of twisted together to create your strand of yarn. It gets very confusing. So one of the most common transitions is, especially when we're in the UK, is worsted weight yarn in the US is comparable to an Aran weight yarn in the UK, but it's only comparable. Worsted is actually tends to be a little bit thicker than what we get here in the UK, and it's also known in the US as a size 4 yarn. In Australia, I actually quite like their counting system. It can come across as quite confusing if you're not used to thinking about it, but it's very, very simple and straightforward because they simply count the plies. A worsted in the US becomes a 10 ply in Australia. And for us in the UK, although it would have 10 strands, it's still considered an Aran. Now, obviously, every single yarn brand has their own way of spinning and finishing their yarns, so their actual individual strands or the plies of yarn might differ in size, and therefore the overall yarn weight is also going to be slightly different. To make it really easy for you and to help avoid any more confusion about these changeable yarn sizes, you'll find a link in the description box where you can head over to download my free printable yarn size guide. That covers the American weight system, the yarn weight system, the UK and the Australian weight system as well, so that you can guarantee almost that your yarn can switch from DK to size 3 is going to be quite easy to do. It just makes that little change very, very simple. but it is important to remember that yarn weight is not as easily interchangeable as it can be. If you choose too small a yarn weight, so you're taking a worsted weight pattern down to a DK, everything written in that pattern is going to become smaller. In the same way, if you go from a DK weight amigurumi pattern all the way up to that wonderful blanket yarn, that super chunky blanket yarn, you are going to end up with a giant amigurumi. Not necessarily a bad thing, I think they're super cute, but it's just something to be aware of. One of the yarn sizes I use quite a lot of isn't actually DK, it tends to be, there's all my Aran up here, Aran or worsted. So let me know in the comments what yarn size you're using on your current project, and if you've ever made a yarn substitution based on yarn size. I do have to mention, a little special mention, I've got it in front of me, is one of my favourites, the paint box yarns. Very simply include the yarn weights on their balls of yarn in the UK, most definitely, and it just makes life a little bit easier. So this is a DK cotton, but it's also a size 3 yarn, and it is marked as so. Now this little information band on your any skein of yarn is incredibly important, and it really helps with a couple of the other ways you can easily swap out your yarns. One of the other easy and quick ways to check how to compare your sizes is going to be with your yarn band. If you can't find the exact same brand that you're looking for, a really quick and easy way is going to be to check the yarn band for the recommended hook size. So for instance, with my paint box yarn DK weight yarn, it is recommending a 4mm crochet hook. You will see, if you've never looked at these, you can see on the back there it's got a tiny little crochet hook, and then we've got the size next to it. So you can also see there are 3 different hook sizes on there. Don't worry about that, we'll come back to that in a moment. So for instance, you're looking to swap out your 100% cotton for something a little bit lighter, a little bit easier. We'll come to the fibres in a moment. Very easily, you can just check the hook size that's recommended on the back of the yarn and find something that's comparable. So these are both some of my favourites. We've got, actually I'm wearing this yarn today. You've got your paint box yarn, simple cotton, simply cotton, DK weight, size 3 yarn, has a 4mm hook recommendation. The Lion brand Kubu is a different fibre content, but it is also a size 3 recommending a 4mm crochet hook. Easy swap, right? So the hook size most definitely can be something that can help you interchange your yarn sizes. There's one other really important information that is going to help you that is on the yarn band. It does take us to that subject that not a lot of people like to talk about, and that is of course tension. I will pop a link here, you should hopefully find that in this corner here, a link on how to make a tension swatch. Now there are some projects that you really don't need to worry about it, but if for instance you were making this crochet garment, this is the Gloriosa Flame with the lovely flame stitches down the side, Gloriosa Flame sweater, which does use this lovely Lion brand Kubu, but maybe you can't get hold of it, maybe it's slightly out of your price range. It's not that expensive really for the yardage, you get a lot on here, but perhaps you wanted to make it in the 100% cotton. This is quite a good example actually. So you might check that the hook sizes match. We know they do, but there is more information on here, although this one is a little bit clearer. There is this lovely, I don't know how close I can get that without it getting too blurry. You can see that there is a tension gauge on the yarn ball. Now, this information is actually really useful when we're substituting yarn, because you can see what the estimated gauge is going to be worked up with the recommended hook size. So it means it's another way of comparing these yarns. So for instance, with the DK Simply Cotton, it's saying that over 4 inches or 10 centimetres, you should get 22 stitches. And then in the Kubu, she has to look. Da, da, da. You're going to get 18 stitches. So there's a 4 stitch difference across these 2 recommendations. And with the rows, you get 30 rows in the DK cotton and you get 16 rows in the Kubu. So actually, are they that similar? Let's maybe try comparing to a Kotlin. So Kotlin is a different fibre content, should we say? And with this one, you're going to get even less than the Kubu. It's a minefield, but all of this information does help us make up our minds as to whether or not our project's going to work out. But one way to guarantee it is to compare the gauge that you make as recommended in the pattern size. If you're not familiar with gauge, you can head on over to the Attention Swatch Guide. I'll pop a link in the description box for you as well to my blog post that explains it in a lot more detail. But ultimately what you're doing, you're checking how many stitches and how many rows you get within a 4-inch square. Ultimately, that is it. But you have to do it in the stitch that was recommended by the designer. They might make their gauge within their pattern, and you need to measure within your pattern to check that your finished size is going to be correct. If you're not making a garment or something that's going to be worn like a hat, or you're just making a scarf, you don't have to make a gauge swatch, but there's no guarantee that your finished size is going to come out correctly. If you really want to ensure that you're going to finish at the right size because you're making a sweater for somebody else, or you're making a hat that needs to fit a certain age, it is highly recommended that you do a gauge swatch, even more so when you're changing or substituting yarns, because they are different. Out of the couple of yarns that I've mentioned already, I've got 3 similar yarns, all with different fibres. Now this is something else we need to consider when we're substituting yarn. It might be the reason that we're substituting our yarn. So yarn fibres can be made up of animal-derived fibres, plant fibres and naturally occurring fibres. I don't tend to use a lot of wool personally. I don't like it next to my skin. I think the highest, sorry, Emily's snoring already, bored of me talking about yarn. I would love to know what your favourite yarn fibre is. Let me know in the comment box so that we can all share our favourite yarn fibres. So for instance, you might want to substitute 100% cotton for something that's a little bit more lightweight, such as a Kotlin or a Kubu. So with 100% cotton, you're going to get, sometimes you can get quite a stiff fabric. And if you want something that where your crochet fabric's a little bit looser or a little bit more movement in it, we call that drape. So the drape of your fabric can change depending on what material that you're using. So I held it the right way up. With the Kubu, for instance, that I'm wearing today, you can see that there's a little bit of stiffness, but this needs another wash or two because it does loosen up over time and it's incredibly soft, but it is a looser fabric than 100% cotton. Now the Kubu is made up of cotton and rayon from bamboo. I'm a huge fan of the cotton blends, especially cotton blended with bamboo. And then we have Kotlin, which is a blend of Pima cotton, oh no, sorry, I can't even say that, Tanguis cotton and 30% linen. So it has a slightly higher cotton content than your Kubu, but 30% less than the 100%. The Kotlin, sorry, is quite soft compared to the 100% cotton, but doesn't always work up as soft as you would hope. Whole other video. We'll come back to my review on Kotlin another day. So yeah, the yarn fibre can have an impact as well. You also need to consider the longevity of the project. So for instance, if I was to have made my Gloriosa sweater in 100% acrylic, is the look and feel of the yarn going to remain the same for the longevity of me wearing that project? So for instance, we know with some acrylics and with some animal derived yarns, we are at risk of getting piling or pilling, little balls of yarn that kind of stick to you that you end up pulling off. Now they're not ideal, but it's just what happens with some yarn fibres. And that actually relates to what is known as the halo around the yarn. So for instance, mercerized cotton, which is kind of got a very thin coating over the top of it, has the smallest yarn halo, the little fuzzy bit around the yarn. And that can impact, it's the yarn halo that then rubs against itself and creates those little balls and the piles. The pilling, I don't know how you actually say it. I don't ever use that word. I just call it, bobbles is what I call them actually, because I had a bobble off where you can cut those off. I digress. But it's the yarn halo that creates those through washing, through wear, and just general use of that project. So for a garment, you want to choose a low pile. Cotton can pile and pull, and little strands can come out, and there's so many different things to consider. But ultimately, when you're substituting yarn, that's another thing potentially to consider, which is harder to do without seeing the yarn in your hand. Especially if you don't know the yarn that's been recommended and you're swapping to something that's sat on your shelf. It's just something to be aware of. I'm going to do a blog post about halos because I think it's great. So ultimately, yes, you can substitute any yarn within any crochet pattern. We just need to remember those all important factors when it comes to substituting yarn, which is of course trying to select a similar weight, if not the same weight yarn. If we aren't selecting the same weight yarn, we're going to have an impact on the finished size. If we use too smaller yarn, that project's going to get smaller. If we use too bigger yarn, then it's going to get bigger. I always laugh when I say that because sometimes we just want that to happen. We want those giant amigurumis made out of blanket yarn. When we're thinking about the actual fibre content of the project, the recommended yarn is suggesting one thing. If we don't like that, we can substitute it. We just need to be a bit more aware of the yarn, the fibre qualities when we're selecting the alternative yarn. Ideally, if you want an easy substitution, just go for the same fibre type if you can. And finally, of course, check that gauge. You can correct a lot of things, a lot of changes from yarn fibre, yarn drape, through to the yarn size just by checking the gauge. That means that you're going to make your tension square and compare it to that one of the gauge listed in the pattern so that you can recreate that either by changing the hook size, going up a hook size for a smaller yarn, going down a hook size, but there will be impacts on that as well. Obviously, if you go bigger, your fabric's going to be looser. If you go smaller on the hook size, your fabric's going to be tighter. All these things need to be considered. There is a secret way that lots of people substitute their yarns. There is a website which I have linked below for you, which is yarnsub.com. It is the ultimate place to go and compare yarns. You can just simply type in the name of the yarn that you're looking for. So perhaps you put in the recommended yarn in the search bar that was in the pattern, and it will give you all the closest matches. And it matches all on these subjects. It checks the gauge, it checks the fibre content, it checks how the yarn is woven as well, because that can have an impact. You don't want to be using a roving yarn, you know, one of those floofy yarns if it's asked for a tightly twisted yarn. YarnSub will literally check all of these things for you and give some recommendations and give you a percentage of match based on those all important 4 factors. Yarn substitution can be a big topic, but in its simplest terms, you can pretty much swap out anything. I hope that you've really enjoyed this crochet tutorial talking about how to substitute yarn and some of the things we need to consider when we're doing it. I hope you join me very shortly for another crochet tutorial, and of course make sure you've hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss out on another one of my crochet tutorials again.